Welcome, everyone. Oh, I'm gonna get there. This is like a dream weekend come true. For me, I'm thinking for some of you too. So if you want books afterwards for our artists to sign, then you can get them downstairs and come up here, and there will be signing up here. So I'm Samantha Baskind. I'm a professor of art history at Cleveland State University. It is my great pleasure to moderate this panel on
You forgot.
Well, it's Jewish Comics and Remembrance. I know that part. I just want the slide to come up. So this is Jewish Comics and Remembrance.
I thought that was a gag.
Yeah.
Well, so hopefully the image will come up at some point. But we're going to look at some slides by our various esteemed panelists, and I'll introduce them while we're getting our images up. This is Ken Krimstein right here. He's a cartoonist and writer whose work has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, and even National Lampoon. His first book was a collection of cartoons titled Kvetch's Kvetch Can. Ken followed that with the nonfiction graphic narrative, The Three Escapes of Hannah Arendt, Tyranny of Truth, which has been translated into 9 languages and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. His book, When I Grow Up, which is downstairs, The Lost Autobiographies of 6 Yiddish Teenagers, was an NPR Best Book of 2021 and a top 10 Washington Post graphic novel of the year. Ken's forthcoming book, based on the real-life encounters of Albert Einstein and Franz Kafka, is titled Einstein in Kafkaland: How Albert Fell Down the Rabbit Hole and Came Up with the Universe. Comes out next year. I've pre-ordered it. Then to his right is award-winning historian and writer Trina Robbins. She's been writing books, cartoons, comics, and graphic novels for over 50 years. Yeah, you can clap for her. She has written and drawn comics from Wonder Woman to Barbie, and she produced the very first all-woman comic book, It Ain't Me, Babe, in 1970. Trina's 2009 book, The Brinkley Girls, the best of Nell Brinkley's cartoons from 1913 to 1940, and her 2011 book, Tarpe Mills and Miss Fury, were nominated for Eisner Awards and Harvey Awards. Her book, The Flapper Queens, won an Eisner Award. Her graphic novel, Lily Renee, Escape Artist, was awarded a gold medal from Moonbeam Children's Books and a silver medal from the Sidney Taylor Jewish Library Awards. In 2013, Trina was voted into the Will Eisner Comic Book Hall of Fame, and last night she won the Juice Macher Award. Yeah. Then we have Stan Mack. He pioneered a documentary style of cartooning with his legendary New York comic strip, Stan Mack's Real Life Funnies, which ran in the Village Voice for 20 years. For a decade in Adweek magazine, Stan Mack's Outtakes took on the world of advertising and media. Stan is a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design and a former art director of the New York Herald Tribune's Book Week and the New York Times Sunday magazine. He has authored and or illustrated over a dozen books for children, teens, and adults, including The Story of the Jews, A 4,000-Year Adventure. Want to hold it up? It's fantastic. I teach it. Stan's work has been described as wonderfully subversive, delightfully whimsical, and anticipating graphic journalism and graphic reportage by 2 or 3 decades. And I'm just checking, are we gonna have slides soon? Do you know if the slides are gonna come up at some point? That would be great, thank you. Well, while that's happening, Peter Cooper is a regular contributor to The New Yorker and Mad Magazine, where he wrote and illustrated Spy vs. Spy for 27 years. Since 2019, he has created a weekly comic for Charlie Hebdo. He's the co-founder and editor of World War III Illustrated, a political graphics magazine, and has produced over 24 books, including Ruins, which won the 2016 Eisner Award. He's done, what is he? He's the recipient of the he just got put on the panel like a few hours ago. So that's why he doesn't have a tag or an ID in front of him. And we have this kind of hastily put together bio, even though he's way more amazing, even than this, if that's possible. He was the recipient of the 2020-21 Coleman Fellowship at the New York Public Library. And he was one of last night's Juicy Award recipients. He's been teaching courses in graphic novels at Harvard University since 2011. All right, we seem to have some images. Awesome. So very broadly, to frame the panel, let me say by way of introduction into the topic that comics have become a recognized medium for engaging with Jewish history, Holocaust narrative, and personal Jewish memory. Jewish graphic narratives, they were brought especially to the fore in the early 1990s by Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize-winning Mouse, have uniquely navigated these complex themes through a dexterous interplay of text and image. Collectively, let's now talk about the diverse comics this group has written and or illustrated that engage the role of remembrance in sequential art. So I'm wondering, esteemed group, what prompted each of you to create graphic histories about subjects related to Jewish remembrance? And I'm going to put up some images as they're talking, just in general to give you a sense, that's not supposed to happen, of what they were up to. So group, what prompted you to create these graphic histories about Jewish remembrance? Someone just start.
Go ahead. You're
the one with the no name tag. Well, I mean, just talking about, the draw what you know, talking about personal history, being Jewish, and remembrance. I'm still trying to remember people's names, but I'm very good at remembering things that happened in the past. And they're a good roadmap to, the different reasons why, personally, I ended up doing the things that I do now, the experience that I had in the past that made me want to do comics and maybe also talk about social, political topics. And comics are, to me, it's just the most difficult art form out there. Like you have to be able to juggle everything if you are, auteur in the form, writing, drawing, lettering, constructing the page, constructing two pages facing each other, making it very readable. And to do that, put that much energy into something that doesn't seem to have, it's just for a joke or a fantasy, doesn't seem to me, it's not worth the effort. And what is talking about real world events and what, that affect us all the time. And that's covering a lot of personal ground.
Ignorance drove me to do my book. As a little kid, I was fascinated by roots for some reason. And unlike my friends, Irish, Italian, even Swedish in one case, they knew where they came from. I knew where they came from. When I asked my folks, where did we come from, with a Jewish background, they had no idea and really didn't want to talk about it. My aunt said we came from Lithuania. Well, I knew a family of Lithuanians. They were giant and they were blonde. They looked neither like my mother's side, who was redheaded and freckled, my father's side, who was kind of short, kind of swarthy. His father looked Asian Indian to me. Anyway, that was as a kid. I can talk about what drove me after that, but that was where it started. I was curious about roots and wondered where we all came from. A lot of different places, but anyway, that was the driving question.
I want to tell you, Stan, my father told me that we came from Isaac, Abraham, and Jacob.
And you believed him?
Yeah, sure. He was
Okay.
my father. And speaking of my father, that's a Minyan Yidden is adapted. I adapted it from my father's book, written in Yiddish in 1938, which I thought was a lost book, but my daughter discovered it on the internet because you can find anything on the internet. He was a writer. He wrote in Yiddish. So that's why I did it. And Lily Renee, it's because I met Lily. I just rediscovered Lily. She was always here, but nobody knew about it, Excuse me. I rediscovered her and made friends with her. And she was just such an amazing person and had had such an amazing life that, it was a comic. Her life was a comic. So that's why I did a comic.
You know, when I asked my parents where we came from, they were like, we don't know, kind of. And then if I asked my grandmother, my Bubby, you don't want to know. What drove me into it was sort of discovery, or not as much rediscovery as discovery, because we went to a talk one miserable February day to get some free Rugelach, and this guy was talking about these diaries that were recently found, autobiographies hidden in a church basement in Vilnius, Lithuania, that hadn't been seen since the war, and they were the autobiographies of Yiddish teenagers that were written for a competition. And then I looked and I said, well, is anybody doing anything with them? And he said, what do you mean doing anything? So then we went to Lithuania and discovered that before World War II, in the 1930s, Vilna was just like the west side of Chicago or the Grand Concourse or you name it. And that was a voyage of discovery, for me. And to put it into pictures was fabulous.
I want more questions, but the wrong slide presentation was put up. This is an older one that before we had our newest member of our panel. So I don't know if the newest one can come up, but if not, we'll just continue. So we have a sense of where the ideas for your books came from, and Trina said something about sources, but does anybody want to address sources a little bit more? What kind of sources you use to create your graphic narratives?
When I was doing mine, we'll go. I mean, there are a lot of photo resource things on the internet now. Jewish Gen, this, that, and the other thing. And I try to hew to at least historical realism. If I couldn't know what the kids looked like, but I needed to know what a telephone in Poland in 1934 looked like, and I needed to know I needed to know. This was great. I found a bus, a public bus. That would take people around, and it was LOT, like remember the Polish airline, LOT airline? It was the LOT bus service. So, I used a lot of photo research that you can find on the internet or archives for that. And I physically went there.
Well, he was my father, so we had lots of photos, so that was easy. But also, I researched what the shtetls looked like. And, they all did kind of look alike, all the shtetls. So even though I couldn't find my father's shtetl, I found lots of others. And, I had lots of photos. And of course, Lily also had photos and gave me photos. And, and again, photos of Austria, of Vienna under the Nazis are not hard to find. So it was easy.
Talking about travel, my initial ways of finding information was, and the way the whole book started was that we took a trip, my partner Janet and I took a trip across the Middle East. I realized we actually were doing Moses's journey in reverse. We started in Jerusalem, went across King Hussein Bridge to Amman, down to Aqaba, across the Red Sea, across the Sinai to get to Cairo and the Nile. So we stood on the top of so-called Mount Sinai, climbed it at night the way you're supposed to do to be able to watch the sunrise. And remembering my kid thing, I thought, how did my family get from the bottom of this mountain to Providence, Rhode Island? It made no sense. It was a giant black hole. So we lived in Jerusalem for a while to get a sense of the history, because I wanted to go all the way back. And that, of course, archaeologically speaking, is where a lot of it, the Bible stories, come from. So my initial research was firsthand back in the Middle East.
In general, I'm trying to find a Venn diagram between things I'm passionate about. Comics is always there. So then I look at like what other topics interest me that much. And you know, personal stories are really great because there's a veracity, truth to them that, you know, you're telling your truth at least. And especially these days, I feel like we really desperately need true things. You know, there's so much, you know, post-fact world questions and like, what is real? And air, clearly, water. But I'm always looking for that thing that, and especially doing a graphic novel, that I'll be able to have sustain for the amount of time, you know, absurd amount of time it will take to do one, that will be subjects that are you know, hold my attention long enough to complete it. Most recently, I'm working on a history of insects and the people who study them, and that goes into issues of race and goes into there's the guy that discovered the waggle dance of the bees was a Jewish scientist in Munich, and he was being harassed and kicked out of school by anti-Semites. And so all these things, you know, the connective tissue between all that. And the research then, if one finds something that they're really interested in like that, or like what you're doing with this book, where it's discovery and it's so exciting. You know, I'm sure that was true with your book on Renee, was that discovery of somebody or something that is going down a rabbit hole, and then when you're searching, doing research, then you come upon even more things that then are this, you know, fantastic journey.
Collection of rabbit holes is probably right. The problem is you have to decide which rabbit holes to go down and which might be a little bit beside the point.
Right, drink me.
All right. How do the four of you as artists and or writers represent remembrance in your comics? In other words, how has the comics medium shaped your messages?
I can give a quick example right up there.
Okay.
The words on the right-hand page are pretty straightforward. It's kind of, I had to make choices about editing, which topics to talk about, which not. But it's the cartoons. I don't know how I could do it without being a cartoonist. It's the cartoons that make the point, that have the irreverence, have the jokes, have the truth of it all. So that's, in my case, cartoons are essential.
I mean, I think for me, when you do a picture, so I was taking these diaries that were written in Yiddish, and they were anonymous. And then I had it translated. And this was an anonymous 19-year-old Polish girl. And the first words of her autobiography was, "I was the 8th daughter." So she had me at that. I mean, the 8th daughter, I have one and I can barely. But then I was like, how can I dramatize this to get into what it would have been like? And her father was a kosher butcher. And somehow or another, I came up with an image of a menorah with 8, I think they have 8 candles on them, right? But they were daughters, and she's lighting the cigarette of her father, who's in the middle. And it kind of sets the scene that I'm going to be telling the story in pictures. That's going to take me to a sort of a truth that might be, because I don't know her name. We don't know her name. It was anonymous. So the graphic medium helps me, like you were saying, to do it in all words. I don't think I could do it, but if I could find an image, and then I use this hard orange pencil line to give it, like, I don't know, the orange color. What can you say? Make it orange.
In my case, it's very straightforward. You know, it's words and pictures because, you know, you need pictures to go with the words and the words to go with the pictures. And it's as simple as that.
I'm very interested in, depending on what the story is, having the style adjust to the story. So if I'm doing Kafka, it ends up looking like German expressionism. And in the case of, well, Heart of Darkness, it's more like journal, like my sketchbook, maybe. Or I did this story about New York and sort of a New York 80s period, and it's in stencils and spray paint. And that I really try to, I'm not drawing in one style and saying this is my style and therefore I have to do it like that only. To me, I think I mean, a lot of it has to do with the question of boredom, which I get bored with one style if I do it too long. And so I'm looking for something that will let me move to another area. But I also think that you want to finding an approach that illuminates the text the most, which in some cases actually, like this one, it's wordless. So illuminating the text, or like Spy versus Spy, is the images as iconography doing the talking.
Any other thoughts?
Did you ask about Remembrance, or
We
I
can-
can't remember?
You know what, I
can't
did
remember.
ask about Remembrance. Would you like to talk about it?
Well, I looked it up on Wikipedia. But I think an impulse that I had, if this is where we're going, is that I wanted to find a new way to tell a tale that maybe a lot of us know. I guess that's Remembrance. I'm not quite sure. So the fact that this was all anonymous teenagers from before the war. And, you know, I was in New York on 9/10/2001. And as I recall, it was a pretty nice day. We didn't really know what was going on. Even on my way into work, you know, it was, my wife called me and said, a plane hit the World Trade. And I thought it was like a Piper Cub or something. We didn't know. You didn't know. So I wanted to get to the point where these kids were before the whole Remembrance thing kicked in. Like they didn't know stuff was going to be remembered. They were just living. So I guess maybe the pictures.
To dovetail with that, I in teaching comics, I'd have the students right after 9/11, they do a comic about like, where were you on 9/11? And I did that year after year, and eventually it's like they're 5-year-olds now. And then they didn't remember. It wasn't part of their, that incredibly important day was just like maybe heard about it and then maybe didn't hear about it.
People are always saying, where were you when? I guess maybe the newest thing is where were you when the World Trade Center was destroyed. But, I remember saying, where were you when Kennedy was killed? And I'm old enough so that I remember saying, and I don't remember, I swear to you, I've drawn a blank. Where were you when Roosevelt died? I remember. You probably, you don't?
No, I was a baby.
Okay. I was listening to Tom Mix on the radio. I liked him. He was my favorite cowboy. And suddenly, and he had a sidekick who was a sheriff. I think it was Sheriff Jim. And he suddenly said, look at that smoke on the hill. And Sheriff Jim said, that's the Widow Smith. And then they broke in and an announcer said, we have to tell you that death has struck the White House.
Wow.
Those were the words he used. And I never found out what happened with Widow Smith.
Remembrance is a little trickier when you go back to Abraham and Sarah. But that was my motivation. I thought, if it's my mother, father, sister, and myself, is there a way to sort of symbolically place them? In other words, a bottom-up history of the Jewish people, much more than the typical, especially when you do these overarching histories. But that was the idea, that these people were going through, here we are sitting here, but we might have been sitting in Lithuania in 1500 or so. In that case, where were we? What were we doing? What was going on up above? What was happening from the outside? What were we on the inside? It's not a book of faith, by the way. It's a book of history. Although the book is a lot more religious than I am, I have to say. But how to do that was kind of like the challenge, a bottom-up history of the entire spectrum of how we got here, for those of you who are of the same background.
I think that's one of the values, to go back to what I said before about truth and facts and all that. One of the values of doing comics like this, talking about these different histories, is a way to solidify them and say, you know, this is what was going on at that time, and that they can become an historic document for, and especially if you're doing your own stories of a time, then that's how we know more about what people were feeling actually at, you know, in an era that you don't get necessarily from the news. And it's more, makes it more personal.
Well, over the course of working on your different projects, and you can talk about any of them or all of them, did your attitude toward the subject change as you were doing this research, as you were creating? So like stylistically or conceptually, how did your projects change? Or do they remain static? You know, it's just interesting to see the progress of, we're so lucky to have, you know, these four esteemed creators here. So let's hear about it.
I've always had an attitude problem. So I went into this project figuring, you know, I did start with Bible history, but with a lot of archaeological history thrown in, with the idea of being a bit more objective of it. And, you know, the history of the Jewish people can be presented as pain over pleasure, you might say. But that was not where I was coming from. I came from a more objective view. But the idea began over time, exactly what you're saying. It became kind of a celebratory history. That's why I use the word adventure, which people may be offended by. But the fact, for all of the horrors of Jewish experience, it's an amazing adventure, and it's one to be very proud of. It's a celebratory history. So my attitude changed a lot. Not that I go to synagogue any more often, or in a lot of other ways reflect it, but
You did while you were working on the book, right?
Uh-huh.
Sort of like-
this was the church.
Yeah, that was the church.
While he was making the deal.
Synagogue, I'm sorry. Point taken.
I think as I worked on this one, you know, I went to Vilna, and it was great, and I did all this research, and then I came back, and my mom says, you know, my grandmother's from Vilna. I'm like, well, why didn't you tell me that before I went there? But as I was working on the book, I was starting to connect with certain aspects of Yiddish culture that I didn't even really appreciate. I had to do a lot of research on it, and I started really getting into Yiddish movies and Yiddish music, as my wife knows. But I got, and I've gotten very interested in what happened in Yiddish culture in America, because I coined this term for this, what I call a nation without a borders, Yiddishuania. And it extended all the way to Argentina, you know, because they got people to enter this competition, 700 people, teenagers, from as far away as Argentina. And then I started to learn about the white slave trade in Argentina, and tango music. And I found out that tango music was so popular in Warsaw and all these things. So I think I learned about roots that I didn't even know that I had, you know, when I was working on the book.
I had an uncle who wound up in Argentina, and that's how I found out that there's huge Jewish population in Argentina. He wound up in Argentina. The rest of the family wound up in New York because he had pink eye when he got to Ellis Island, and so they wouldn't let him in.
Yeah, I heard
So
that.
he went on.
By the way, there's that map sideways, hard to read, but talking about Argentina,
Oh, yeah, there it
I
is.
did break down the numbers of the people that left Eastern Europe, especially around what they call the Pale, and the various places they went in the numbers.
And you can see it's pretty thick. Not as thick as the United States, of course, but it's thicker than the other countries.
115,000 is not chopped liver.
Right.
When I got this fellowship to work on, I proposed I do a book on the history of insects and the people who study them, and got this fellowship in February of 2020, early February, and then it was going to start in September. And when I arrived at the library, it was the height of COVID, and the library was closed to the public, and the other fellows who get this, we were supposed to be interacting and all. We had to wear masks. We weren't allowed out of our offices without masks, and the whole thing was, I just felt like crying. And then I started walking around the library, and it was completely empty, and the Rose Room and all these incredible rooms in the library, if you're familiar with it, without people in it, were more fantastic. And it handed me what I could do with the project, which then became kind of a post-apocalypse. It's just the insects are in the library, there are no people. And it was so much easier to draw too. It just was, but it was one of those weird things. And I think that that's another thing that hopefully can happen in a project, is as it's developing, if it gives you a direction, if something shifts and you get different information, if you can apply that. And it's kind of like, I guess, when Cezanne was painting and everybody painted the scene as if they never moved. And then Cezanne noticed that when I move my head, the table is not exactly the same angle. So I'm going to do that, and that led to Cubism. It's sort of like being conscious while you're working on a project may actually send you off in a direction you hadn't anticipated.
I mean, it really is such an adventure. I'm looking at Trina's page here, and one of the things that I so feel about what we do and what I do is I say geography is destiny, and in a way that's just like pictures matter. When you place yourself in that setting, there's columns that are like Greek type columns, but there's soldiers and there's children and they're in a room, and comics transport you to a place, and then the place means something more, a lot, right? Wouldn't you say? I mean, I don't, whether it's a scriggly New York downtown street or a fancy apartment, somehow the way people look at comics, the visual gives you a sense of meaning as much almost as the words or the characters. And that's what I love about it.
I would like to, you guys now like to know that the artist is Ann Timmons.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's not my art.
Not
I
your
wrote
art.
it.
Oh, you
I
wrote
wrote it, and I worked with.
You work with her.
I work, of course. And Ann and I work very well together. We've worked on a lot of projects together. We're currently working on a 12-page story for a book called Partisans, and we're telling the story of 3 Dutch girls in the 1940s who they would go to bars. They would get all dressed up with lipstick and stuff and go to bars. They were just teenagers and flirt with the Nazis and get the Nazis to go with them into the woods, and then they would shoot them. And that's the story we're telling right now.
And I would guess that just from what you're describing, aside from the fact that it reminded me of some dates that I I had, sorry. But I can picture it. I mean, I don't, just so you're working very closely together on what did a
Yes.
bar look like then? What did a forest look like
Yes.
then? Yeah.
Oh, I have pictures
Yeah,
again.
yeah.
Lots of pictures.
You've done very well with the bullet holes. You hardly even notice it. We're talking about art differences, but me talking about Jews, we're talking about, 20 opinions for every 3 people. How to deal with all of the different aspects of the Jewish culture and religion in one timeline was really challenging. I had to have it vetted by a whole spectrum of experts. I remember there's one mistake in the first, this is a second or third generation, the first generation. I talked to a Orthodox professor, college professor, and I said, what do I do about Jesus? And he said, leave him out. I mean, he's so unimportant given that period in Jewish affairs then.
You're forgiven.
And then, we're going to do this the whole time. So I asked a Reform rabbi from Brooklyn, and he said, of course, we got to put him in, but remember, you better get it right. And as it turned out, the only mistake of any worth in that first volume was I got Jesus wrong in one panel, but it's corrected now. But anyway, the whole idea.
Yes, we
Again,
want
what
details.
did he?
How did you do it?
Did he like not walk on the water? He fell in, or what?
Or the sandals were Birkenstocks. I mean,
I said that his followers saw him rising. No, they saw him, he'd risen. It wasn't like a spectrum rising out of the grave. And that was the suggestion that I had, not intentionally, but that's the way it came out. Just a subtle difference in the choice of words. When you're doing comics, as we all know, each word carries a lot of weight, especially with Jewish topics. So that I got there, but I didn't get any. I was accused of by one very religious person wrote in upset, got the publisher, Jewish Lights, a little nervous. She thought I was somehow linked to Jews for Jesus, which is not anything like what the book is, but that's where she was coming from. But for the most part, what a good reporter does is he checks every fact 2 or 3 times before we watched All the President's Men last night. You didn't go with one fact. You had to confirm what it was. And I tried to do that. Anything in there has a foundation of at least 1 or 2 other people.
Well, and that's one of the horrors of when a book is printed is you
Yeah.
can't undo it then. And so it's really good if you figure it out in advance.
How do you do that?
I'm running into that with this insect book, not to keep on harping on that, but it's what I'm working on now. But I'm running it by entomologists and kind of in a variety of people, but there's like the fly expert in England, and entomologists are like comic book nerds. Like, hey, if you're interested in what they do, they're like, sure, well, I'll look at it. So it's great, but I really don't want to have like something wrong. And I have already gotten the old, the wing venation on the dragonfly you drew there is, they would never have their wings up like that. It's going to be down. And I that's what the kind of thing I want to get right in general. And so I'm like super happy to make the changes, when I can, and not just have somebody tell me when they're holding the book in their hands that I got something wrong.
Are there as many critics of entomology as there are of Jewish history? I
Oh,
don't know.
no.
Right. Who do you envision your audience to be? Do you envision your audience, depending on the book certainly, but do you envision your audience to be just Jewish? Are you hoping to do something, more broad with these? Like, how the comics form take shape depending on the audience you have in mind? And how do you make these subjects, which might be obscure for some or overwrought to others, how do you make Jewish history and culture more interesting or exciting or moving or compelling or funny to your readers?
I mean, the publishers certainly want us to make them more interesting to a broader audience. But also, I mean, I have used, used, not the word I wanted, but like to do Kafka Metamorphosis or other Kafka stories, I'm trying to bring people who don't read comics to it, the forum, and say like, no, you can do all these different amazing things with comics. And sometimes, the subject matter will do that. So, if you're talking about the Holocaust, or you're talking about, one history or another that somebody's interested in, but they wouldn't think of it as being in comics, and it's as a way to draw them in. I'm really looking for widening the audience for the form as well as the subject matter.
I did my Lily Renee book. Actually, it's aimed at younger readers. It's aimed at, I think, what they call tweens. But, I wrote it for myself. I mean, when I write, excuse me. When I write for myself, and the only difference between something for adults that I'm writing or something for kids that I'm writing, the only difference is that the one for kids doesn't have any sex, but it's the same thing, because, I write for myself. But it was written, to be read by younger people. My father's book, I think I wrote it for old Jews. Well, I'm an old Jew,
I think I try to write for everyone and for myself, I guess, because it's like if I see something and I'm like, oh, I've seen that before. Oh, that, like with this book, I wanted to try and write a different way of looking at the horrible events of the Holocaust, and I couldn't deal with it head on, and I also didn't want the victims to be these angels. I wanted them to be people, because my sensibility is that people are more interesting than angels, at least while you're alive. So I wrote it for myself, and when I saw stuff being fake, I had to like edit myself. But I didn't write it just for Jewish people. I wrote it for, I don't know how to do, I guess if I wrote it in Hebrew, maybe it would have been. No, I just write for people, you know.
Well, we've got a sense of some of your future projects, insects. And Trina told us a little bit about Partisans. Are there other projects that related to Jewishness or remembrance that any of you are working on at this particular time?
Well, I have a book will be out. I don't know if it fits that category. For those of you who were around in New York and a little bit older, perhaps you remember my Real Life Funnies. There's going to be a giant collection of them, which is basically the history of New York in the 70s and 80s, which in a way is, in a sense, Jewish culture, if not history. So that'll be out, and it's certainly bottom-up history. It's stories for everybody, like you guys, one at a time, sometimes caught unawares, and now put together in a collection. So,
Stan, is it going to be comprehensive, like just every week as it happened, pretty much?
it's going to be chronological because New York itself changed a lot. It started in 74 and ended at the beginning of 95. So it's a generation, essentially. Well, New York, for you guys, you remember, the 70s was a lot different. Late 60s, early 70s, a lot different from the later 70s. Certainly different from the yuppie invasion of the 80s, and then after that, it continues. So it had to be chronological. I have a short intro before each chapter to say, this is what was happening to me. It's my life. It's your life. We're getting older, and so and that's the approach. It also got a lot more serious in the 80s, as you know.
Well, but it will be like a documentary when you lay it out like that. It'll be like a history.
It's a book of history.
Yeah, yeah.
I think so.
You working on it? Well, I'm working on Einstein and Kafka. I think they were Jewish. They actually knew each other in Prague. And when I heard that they were in the same circle in Prague in 1911, when they were both amongst this crowd, I think somewhat schmendricks, or I mean, I asked the woman who ran the Einstein archive at Caltech, did Einstein keep a date book in 1911? Because I would have loved to look at it. I'm doing a biography. No, of course he didn't. He was a nothing. He was just a low-level academic. So, when I found out that they actually kind of were in the same salon or party crew, whatever you would call it, in Prague in 1911, I wanted to write about it, and it touches on a lot of Jewish themes, but also I think their work is universal interest. So,
Where are you in the book?
done
It's coming out.
next year, God willing.
You're going to speak to Kafka groups like you are the Jewish group?
They scare me. No, what's that?
Because they're Kafkaesque.
They're Kafkaesque, yeah. They're all buggy, like, well, this is, I learned, again, it was a process of discovery. I mean, I found that he was pretty funny, actually. And you did too, Peter, right?
And also he's like 6 feet tall, which you have
Yeah,
this image of
right.
this little guy who's
And
like bummed out all the time, and it turns out
He-
he's tall, good looking.
Yeah,
and
tall,
funny.
good looking, very sharp dresser, swam laps every morning.
Oh.
A large part of the book is him and his friend Max Broad going to swim. He was a big swimmer, vegan, and kind of miserable in certain respects, but also very funny and a great, evidently, for those of you into this, wonderful insurance agent. Workman's comp. In fact, I discovered when I was working on it, leave it to academia, some guys in Princeton, maybe, or that was published, they actually went through all his insurance writings before he became, and they said, you can see what he was going to do here in the way he wrote about like this claims case and stuff. Yeah.
He also drew. Yeah, there's a
He
book
drew
that just
beautifully.
came
In
out.
fact, a great book came out. Here we are,
Yeah.
but last year, right?
Yeah.
Because he was actually an amazing cartoonist. So yeah, we'll see. But Yeah, Kafka groups. Never physicists, though.
Well, I have finished writing about the three Dutch girls. Excuse me again. And that's what it's called. It's called Three Dutch Girls. And Anne is drawing it at this very moment. Well, maybe not at this very moment. She's drawing it.
All right, I just got a sign that we're supposed to get close to questions, but first I just wanted to say, so Dr. Raphael Madoff was supposed to be here. He's the founding director of the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies, and he wanted me to tell you that his Whistleblowers, Four Who Fought to Expose the Holocaust to America, is coming out in 2024. He wrote it, he created it with the artist Dean Motter. So just to let you know about that. And as far as remembrance goes, just, as a sort of a summary, we're looking at these individual moments of remembrance in all of these great projects. And though Stan covered a long swath of time, and, something that interests me also, just to think about as a group, I looked at comics and how comics were depicting the Warsaw Ghetto over time from 1943 to the current moment. So how do we look at the same Jewish moment in comics and remember it stylistically and conceptually and ideologically differently? So, do we have some questions? Yes.
I'm just wondering, the Holocaust is such intense barbarity. When you're writing about it, how do you balance it? How do you tell this? I think of Schindler's List, and the Commandant in that movie, he's like toned way down. They do not show that man as he was. They show him as a way we can accept. If they show him as he was, no one would believe it. People just wouldn't believe it. So when you're writing about this subject, how do you show the intensity of it, the horror of it, while still managing to make it acceptable to an audience that they can digest what you're trying to tell them? I didn't show it. And the weird thing was, I had to rely on people having a certain amount of collective consciousness that they maybe knew about it. And what's even weirder is there are, believe it or not, I wrote it thinking that you would provide your own horrible postscript in your mind. And there are some people out there who don't even know about that. So my book would fall on deaf ears, and that really upsets me. I hope that's not the case, but that's how I dealt with it. I didn't show.
When you cover a topic as broad as mine, seeing the Holocaust in terms of the larger picture is one way, at least. I mean, you can go in tight and talk about the horror to certain individuals, but to see it in terms of 1,000 years does put it in a different context. I'm going to throw a bomb here, maybe. It hasn't come up today that I've heard, and that is what's going on in Israel and the Palestinians today. Everybody has an opinion about. There's no middle ground, and they're really extreme. To some extent, everybody is right, and everybody is not necessarily looking at the other side. But my advice is, if you really want to get a picture of what's happening today, go back and start with the end of the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
And before and after the First World War and after the Second, at least put it into some sort of a larger picture. And that's not having any answers to it, but just an answer to what you're talking about.
That's very good, because I get a lot of posts on Facebook by people who don't really know the history. And they're just they're spouting what they heard other people spout.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, I have a little bit of a broader question. So first of all, thank you for being here. You're all dealing with very, very heavy, serious subjects, and yet the books are called comics. So I'm wondering how each of you feels in the modern world, not in a world where comics really came to be in the 20s and the papers. How is that perceived by a broader audience? Because comics, you said words matter, right? Adventure versus whatever happened. How does comics relate to what each of you are doing and telling, especially with regards to remembrance? when most people think of, oh, comic, right? But a comic is something really similar to all, right?
I mean, it depends on where you are in the world, because in Europe, comics have been regarded highly
Yeah.
for a long time. The United States, we regressed in the 50s when there was a crackdown that put a code on comics where they were self-censoring. So the direction that they were going, where there might have been a wider adult audience for comics, had this, it was under McCarthyism. And it was part of that whole scene where there was literally, comic book burnings and all that. And that, which we have to watch out for, because we're definitely re-entering a phase that's not dissimilar. There's amazing books now that are being banned, and that that are really being considered threatening. So I would say, actually, in many ways, a lot of people are taking comics very seriously in the worst way, which is they're saying they're literally a threat to, they're going to turn all children gay, or whatever it is the current fear about, choose your own book, that or inform people, or be about the Holocaust, be about, Mouse got banned in McMinn County just last year.
But do you feel there's an understanding of what a comic is? When I grew up in England, a comic was something for the kids. So do you think that's preventing maybe a younger generation from understanding?
I wonder if the younger generation you're talking about doesn't think of comics the way you do.
Exactly.
If you're 25 or 18,
Yes.
you understand what a comic means today, but the problem is, I don't know what the dictionary says it is. I'm old enough to remember when I looked down on the idea of comics. I wasn't a comic
Right.
cartoonist, I was an illustrator or an art director. It's all pretty much Spiegelman kind of kicked over the bucket in a way, and
He
it's
did.
changed a lot.
He did. There are still so many parents, so many adults who think comics are just either Snoopy or Spider-Man. I taught in Connecticut once. I was teaching comics, writing comics to kids, and the parents. And this is Connecticut. This is middle class America. It's not the slums. But they would say, I would say, come into the class. You might really like it. And they would say, oh no, I'm just a mother, or something like that. And or, oh, my son really likes to draw Snoopy. They didn't understand what comics were. And I would say, I always used Mouse as an example. Do you know that this book won a Pulitzer Prize? And they didn't know that. They didn't know that. They went, well, whoa, really? And like I say, these are middle-class Americans. They should know better.
We have come a tremendous distance from starting in about 2000 in the United States, where bigger publishers were jumping on that. And the young adult market is enormous. There are books like Gray and Intelligent Meyer, for example, does a book called Smile. It's selling as much or more than Stephen King. So it really is. There's a young audience that's aware and interested in it. And in fact, in a lot of ways, I think that to have a full knowledge, visual vocabulary, knowing comics is pretty essential. And it bleeds into all these other forms, in different ways in social media and movies. But I really think that the whole next generation and ongoing has a much greater sense of that. And there's less of that block, but still run into it. But I felt like much of maybe my first decade it was almost as a hobbyist, because it's very hard to get paid to do comics, because mainstream publishers didn't do that. But in the 90s, that got better. But I feel like that's one of the flags I've been carrying, is trying to get adults to recognize that comics are not just for kids. It's not Garfield and Batman only, and that it can be just all these other things. But I think there's so many examples here that are disproving any question about what can be covered and who might read them.
And let me just say, and then we're going to take more questions. My university now has an entire committee to create a graphic novel and comics collection at the university for 25,000 undergraduate students. So that's where they're spending their money right now. Question in the back, sir.
I wanted to give an answer.
Oh.
All your answers are great, but the very simple answer is that comics, the title is a problem, and that's why the publishers changed it to what you just said.
Graphic novels, graphic narratives.
Yeah, no, the name of my class at Harvard is Comics and Graphic Novels, because if it just said comics, they might think it was a clown class.
Yes, question?
Yeah, my question is, I guess, for everyone. I'm an academic who's published a lot of very long books, and I'm transitioning to graphic novels. And I'm familiar with all of your work, and what I admire is how the process that you're talking about, the rabbit holes and these extensive details that you all research. And I was wondering how each of you personally could maybe speak to how you kind of bring that down to the essence. You know, you can have a 600-page work. It has to be certain size. It has to follow certain conventions. I was wondering how you think about once you've traveled to Vilna and get all the details, or after you've studied all the etymology, or after you've done your extensive travel to get at your essence of the story. What is it that you decide to jettison, and what is it that you make sure, in your own opinion, to keep that is the essence of the story?
I'm going to throw in mine real fast because it's unique, I think. I did a book, first book I ever did. I did some kids' books, but they were illustrated. First book, graphic book I ever did was a history of the American Revolution. I didn't know how to do a book, but I knew how to do a comic strip of 10 to 12 panels, because that's what I did. So I did a dozen comic strips, each with its own punchline, following the revolution and looking for that moment that I could end each strip with, and then I just sort of strung them together. It's a different sort of approach.
All right, we do need to wrap up, but thank you, Ken, Trina, Stan, and Peter, and please go downstairs, buy their terrific books, come on up, they'll sign them. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Wow.